Hi, I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. China's control over Hong Kong might be even stronger after Sunday. That's when Hong Kong is holding an election. But because of new rules put in place by China, most people, even if they do vote, won't get much of a say in who makes up the government.
And this election has been called a sham, it's been called undemocratic. What's interesting about it is this desire to keep this very thin veneer of democracy over a system which is growing ever more undemocratic.
James Griffiths is the Globe's Asia correspondent. He'll tell us how the election shows Beijing's tightening grip on Hong Kong and what's happened to its pro-democracy movement. This is The Decibel. James, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So what's the mood like in Hong Kong right now, heading into this election on Sunday?
I've covered Hong Kong for over 7 years. I've covered multiple elections here. And I think one of the biggest differences is that while Hong Kong has not really been heading in the direction that a lot of people in the pro-democracy camp would want, that's the reason that sparked the 2014 protests, the 2019 protests, all of this. There was always this sense of optimism and of a real kind of faith in the democratic system or the limited democratic system that was in place. Even in 2019, there were local elections that they had an over 70% turnout. There were lines around the block. The counting had to be delayed. There was a huge belief in voting and showing your opinion and giving a message to the government in that way. And I think that's what's been the strangest thing about covering this current election is that kind of optimism and that kind of faith in the system has gone. Just very, very, kind of ordinary, non-radical pro-democracy voters who do not intend to turn out, who feel disillusioned.
And this is an election that is called the quote, patriots only election. Can you tell us, what is that supposed to mean?
So in the wake of the national security law, which was imposed on Hong Kong by Beijing last year, there was a reform of how elections work here to make sure that, yes, that Hong Kong is governed by, quote, patriots. And what that essentially means is that now all candidates for public office and indeed a lot of civil servants positions and things like that require oaths to the central government, or they require some kind of vetting. So every candidate that is standing in Sunday's election has been pre-vetted by this thing called the Election Committee, which is completely dominated by pro-Beijing heavyweights and government figures.
Outside observers have been fairly critical of this election, though. Why is that?
There is very strong argument that this is not a democratic election. That if you have pre-vetting for every candidate, it doesn't really matter that if you then let people vote freely for them. This was actually a problem which dates back to 2014. That was one of the suggestions for a reform that provoked the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. People said this isn't real democracy if all the candidates are vetted. And we've ended up with that system in a slightly different form now in legislative elections. And this election has been called a sham. It's been called undemocratic. What's interesting about it is this desire to keep this very thin veneer of democracy over a system which is growing ever more undemocratic. So in the past, Hong Kong has elected about half of the city's parliament, LegCo. In the new system, they'll be electing only 20 out of 90 seats. But again, those 20 seats, the candidates for them have all been pre-vetted. So, they're choosing 20 lawmakers out of an approved list. So there's that control already put in by Beijing. And then 70 other lawmakers are essentially chosen by pro-Beijing groups. And so it's quite a strange situation that you have, that there is an election going on, but not one that necessarily the public's engaged with, and not one that's necessarily as democratic as it would like to pretend to be.
So another factor here, too, is that many of the pro-democracy candidates aren't running because they're either in exile or they're in prison. When and how did that happen?
So this goes back to the national security law, which was imposed on Hong Kong last year by Beijing and banned subversion, secession, and collusion with foreign powers. 3 offences, which are, as people can hear, pretty broad and vague and have been used in a very broad way. About a week or so after the national security law came into force, there was a primary election held by pro-democracy parties, which was designed to thin the field ahead of the main election and give them a better chance of getting in and not splitting the vote. In January this year, all of the candidates who took part in that primary election were arrested and dozens of properties were raided. And the government said that this was a subversive act and it was designed to undermine the election, the legislative election, by giving pro-democracy parties a better chance. And 47 of the 53 people that were arrested are currently facing charges. They face years in prison. A lot of them have been remanded in custody since last January, so they're coming up on almost a year in prison.
Why does Beijing care if there's a democracy movement in Hong Kong or not? What are they scared of?
That's a good question, because I think a lot of people would argue that had Beijing left Hong Kong alone and let Hong Kong get on with its limited form of democracy that it had after 1997, when the Brits handed Hong Kong over to China, that the city wouldn't necessarily have, tilted towards independence or separatism or any of these things that Beijing really fears. But it's actually Beijing's heavy hand, especially since 2014, that has, encouraged support for separatism in Hong Kong. That's one reason. And then there's also the fact that in the early years of Hong Kong's existence and under Chinese rule, that there was a sense, and maybe a very overly optimistic sense, that China itself would liberalize and head in Hong Kong's direction. And that also clearly hasn't happened.
The Legislative Council, their parliament, or LegCo as it is also called, it has a very complicated structure. And we don't have to get into every tricky detail of it because it is complicated. But I guess the really important part is that it's not as simple as our system, where every citizen gets one vote towards a candidate. Why is Hong Kong's system so complicated?
I think the most important thing to remember when we talk about especially LegCo is that this is essentially a colonial system. It is the system that was in place under the Brits, and it continued to be in place post 1997. So this was a system that was never really designed with representative democracy in mind. It was designed to inform a all-powerful colonial governor and give people some limited form of representation. So after 1997, we had a system where around half of the seats in LegCo were elected by the public, that so-called geographic seats, and they're your standard kind of parliamentary ridings, and they work very similar to any other country with parliamentary democracy. But at the other half of seats in LegCo were functional constituencies, which are sometimes very, very small business and kind of society groupings. So there's a agriculture and fisheries functional constituency. There's a financial services functional constituency. And because these groups are so small, and because often their business was completely dependent on relations with the mainland, they tend to be very, very pro-Beijing. And sometimes, people would run unopposed in those seats. And since the new reforms have come in, it's become even more complicated and even less possible for pro-democracy candidates to win a majority. Because now there are 20 seats which are nominally elected and open to the public, and there are 70 seats which are almost guaranteed to return pro-Beijing candidates.
Yeah, so when we put it like that, 20 out of 90 is the say basically that people get. That's not a huge percentage then.
It's not, and again, it's 20 out of 90 with only vetted candidates, which ensures that you're not going to get the kind of radical lawmakers or pro-localist lawmakers that you got in 2016, which was the last time Hong Kong elected a parliament. That was the most radical parliament that had ever been elected, and was maybe one of the things that really alarmed Beijing.
James, can you tell us, what's it been like reporting in Hong Kong now in the run-up to this election?
Even within the very constrained new system, this vetted patriots-only system, there is a degree of tension and of paranoia that you've never seen before. So Hong Kong was somewhere that was very, very easy to talk to candidates. You had a huge amount of access to politicians across the spectrum as a reporter. That's not the case this time. It has been very, very difficult as a reporter to get access to especially to the candidates who describe themselves as non-pro-establishment or centrist candidates who, are kind of appealing for pro-democracy votes. I had one candidate after I'd been texting him for quite a long time of trying to set up an on-the-record interview. He responded, "I'm sorry, I think I can't do the interview because of legal problems." And, there's this fear that if they say the wrong thing, they either could be disqualified from the race or, even worse, could face some kind of repercussions under the security law. So, not only is this election happening under this kind of depressed poll and this lack of optimism and enthusiasm, it's also happening under quite a real degree of fear and tension due to the security law.
Do we have a sense of what we expect the voter turnout to be like come Sunday?
There has been some polling. A very well-respected think tank did a poll a couple of weeks ago, and they found around 50% of respondents said they planned to vote, which is the lowest they said they'd had since 1991. Some pro-Beijing figures even have said that we could go as low as 20%. So Carrie Lam, who's Hong Kong's leader, Beijing-appointed leader, she said last week that actually, low turnout isn't too much of a big deal because, quote, when the administration is doing well and its credibility is high, voter turnout will decrease because people do not have a strong impetus to choose different lawmakers. But at the same time, they are also frantically, urging people not to boycott or spoil their ballots.
How has the Hong Kong government responded to calls for boycotts?
Very aggressively. The Hong Kong government has made it clear that they regard encouraging other people to boycott or to spoil their ballots as illegal. They've already arrested a number of people within the city for sharing posts on social media, encouraging people to do so. And they've even taken a very aggressive stance towards foreign media and foreign figures who have been from overseas urging people to boycott. So recently we saw an editorial in the Wall Street Journal which said, quote, "Boycotts and blank ballots are one of the last ways for Hong Kongers to express their political views." The Hong Kong government reacted furiously to that. They called it baseless. They accused the paper of scaremongering. And they even threatened the paper that this was an illegal act, irrespective of whether the incitement is made in Hong Kong or abroad. Arguably, they've promoted this idea of boycotting far more than any of these figures because, barely a day goes by without some Hong Kong government official coming out and saying how bad it would be if everyone boycotted the election. So they're clearly very worried about this.
Hong Kong elections in the past have sparked huge protest movements as well. So, for example, the 2014 umbrella movement, which people might remember. Is there any chance that protests will happen again this Sunday?
So since the security law came into force, there has not been any mass protests. It's difficult to predict, but I would be very surprised if there was any kind of mass protest over the weekend or even in the weeks coming. Both because a lot of the traditional organizers are in prison or have already fled, and also because of this sense that apart from a riot, to go out and protest, you do need a kind of optimism and hope that your protest is going to do something, that it's going to change something. And I think Hong Kongers have had the lesson really underlined to them that it doesn't matter how many people you turn out, the government's not going to listen to you.
From everything we've talked about here, James, it does sound like this election is really to present the appearance of democracy, but this is very much controlled by Beijing. Why even have this election in the first place?
I think that's a good question. It is costing Hong Kong taxpayers a lot of money. It's probably going to have a very low turnout. It's not going to provide necessarily any kind of sheen of legitimacy to LegCo, especially in the eyes of the international community. And I think it maybe speaks to the kind of brand that democracy still has. That, even the word democracy, even if in principle it isn't taking place, that being able to say we have a democratic system, we had some kind of votes, that seems to still have a huge kind of cachet with leaders, both with the Hong Kong government and even with Beijing. Beijing's recently been arguing that actually its own system, it's the one-party Communist Party system, is actually democratic and is its own form of democracy. I think it kind of points to the degree to which the word democracy, if not the system, can be a fig leaf for all kinds of autocratic systems.
James, thank you so much for joining us today and walking us through all this.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, that's it for today. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms. Our producers are Madeline White and Cheryl Sutherland. David Crosby edits the show. Kasia Mihailovich is our senior producer, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks to James Griffiths. You can find more of his work at theglobeandmail.com. You can also email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at MenakaRW. And if you haven't already, please follow The Decibel wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.